The lake at night always felt different than it did in the day. In the daylight, the water sparkled, birds skimmed across the surface, and the cabin looked like a safe place to rest. But when the sun sank and the fog rolled across the glassy water, it became something else entirely. The lantern on the porch flickered as if fighting to stay alive, and the ripples on the water moved even though the air was still. I remember standing on the dock, staring out across the lake. The silence was heavy, broken only by the faint creak of the wood beneath my feet. That's when I noticed something across the water, standing on the opposite shore. A figure blacker than the night itself. No face, no details, just a tall, shifting shadow. At first, I thought it was a trick of the fog, but then it raised its arm, slowly, as if pointing directly at me. I never should have stayed by the water that night. I never should have watched to see if it would move closer, because that was the moment everything changed. The lake was still. A thin mist curled over the water, clinging to my boots. Even the reeds seemed frozen. It was early autumn. The air was damp, carrying the scent of wet earth and decaying leaves. A cold hum ran through the silence, almost like the lake itself was holding its breath. I first saw it across the water, a figure, unmoving. At first, I thought it might be a fisherman, waiting for a catch. But there was no rod, no lantern, no flicker of fire. I squinted. The mist shifted around it. It looked taller than a man, its outline blurred and sharp at the same time, like a reflection I couldn't focus on. The lantern by my side flickered, a soft, wavering light that barely reached the water's edge. And when it flickered again, the figure was closer, closer than before, closer than it could have walked. My breath caught, a shallow rhythm against the quiet. I stepped forward. The mud sucked at my boots. The air tasted metallic, coppery, and still it didn't move. I wanted to speak, but my voice dissolved into the fog. The reeds whispered, brushing against each other, as though warning me. A ripple ran across the lake, not from wind, not from fish. Something in the shadow of the figure moved, a flicker of shape. Or maybe it was only the lantern playing tricks. I blinked, and it was closer again. Closer. The air pressed in. My hands felt damp, sticky with cold. I heard soft footsteps, but they weren't mine. They didn't belong to anything I could see. I wanted to turn, to run. But the lake had a pull, quiet and subtle, a whisper against my bones. The lantern swayed. Its light danced over the water, and in that pale illumination, the figure stretched taller. Its face remained hidden, but I felt its gaze. Watching, waiting. I swallowed. The hum of the lake grew stronger. Not loud, not harsh, just beneath the skin of the world. I noticed the smell then. Something wet but not water. Something ancient, rotting, and sharp. It made my stomach twist. A shiver ran down my spine. I shivered again, but not from cold. Something else, low and patient, was curling through the air. The figure did not move, yet every time the lantern flickered, it seemed to lean, just slightly, toward me. The reeds brushed my legs. The mist thickened, wrapping around my knees, my waist. I want to call out, but there was no word that could reach across that distance. Only silence answered. A small wave licked the shore. It smelled of mud and old leaves. I stepped back, and still it was there, closer than it had any right to be. Its outline clearer now. Tall, thin, too still. A shadow anchored in the fog. My heart began to whisper in my chest. I could hear it over the hum, over the rustle of reeds, over the subtle, shifting air. And I thought, if I blink, it will move again. I blinked. It was closer. And then, as quietly as it had begun, the figure stopped, not moving, not breathing, just a presence, vast and patient, mirrored across the lake. I stayed where I was, the lantern's light trembling in my grip, the fog curling around the shoreline, the water lapping softly at my boots. I didn't step forward. I didn't turn back. I just listened. The hum of the lake, the rustle of reeds, the soft, impossible footsteps fading into the distance, or perhaps into the fog, and then silence. For a long time, I simply stood there, watching the lake, watching the shadow, waiting, though I didn't know for what. And when I finally dared to move, the mist was already swallowing the figure again. Gone, or never really there at all. But I know it's out there, somewhere beyond the lantern's flicker, waiting. The cabin sat at the edge of the clearing. Twilight stretched in over the pines. The air smelled of damp earth and smoked wood. Inside, the fire had dwindled to a pale glow. It flickered against the walls, soft shadows dancing across the logs. The quiet was heavy, pressed close like a damp blanket. I moved toward the second window. Something in the reflection caught my eye, a dark outline standing where it shouldn't be. I froze. The wood beneath my fingers was warm from the fire, but the chill in the air seeped into my spine. There should have been only me, only the faint hum of embers, only my breath, slow and steady, curling in the cold, yet the shape lingered. Still, watching, I blinked. The outline didn't change. It was just there, a shadow beyond the glass, taller than it should be, darker than the night outside. The fire flickered again. A soft snap of the log shifted the shadows across the cabin floor. I pressed my hand to glass. Cold, smooth, real. I want to call out, but my voice tangled in my throat. The air smelled faintly of smoke and something metallic, sharp. A rustle from the corner of the cabin. Not loud, not sudden, but enough to make the hair along my neck rise. I turned slowly. No one. The shadow in the window stayed, closer than it had been, almost as if it had leaned in. I stepped back. The floor creaked beneath my weight. The outline remained, a dark, silent pulse behind the glass. I pressed my face closer. The reflection was wrong. Not my own. Something else flickered beneath the surface. Too vague to name, but familiar enough to freeze me. The wind whispered outside. The trees scraped against each other, brittle and dry. The shadow didn't move. It only waited. I thought I saw a hand. Just a hint. A faint smear against the glass. Then gone. A trick of the light, or something else entirely. The fire cracked again. A warm scent of pine drifted upward. The shadow didn't soften. It didn't retreat. It just existed. My pulse slowed, then quickened again. A soft pressure in the room, almost like the air itself was watching. My own reflection stared back at me, but off-center. Not aligned. Not right. I wanted to look away. To run to the door, slam it shut, lock the bolt. But curiosity, soft and insistent, held me still. The outline wavered, not like a person moving, but like heat over summer pavement. A presence bending the glass, the light, the very air. I breathed slowly, in through my nose, out my mouth. The hum of the night filtered in through cracks in the walls. The faint metallic scent lingered. I stepped back. The fire cast a long shadow across the floor. My shadow, but in the window there was another, still dark and impossible. And then quietly it shifted, a mere inch, almost imperceptible. But enough. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The cabin seemed to hold its own breath with me. Eventually, the fire dimmed further. The wind softened. The shadow remained in the glass. A patient, silent witness. I left the window. The hum of the night replaced my heartbeat. The scent of smoke lingered, and the second window held its secret, dark and still, as if waiting for someone else to notice. The lake was quiet. Night had settled over it like a soft, dark blanket. Mist hovered just above the water, curling around the pilings of the dock. The air smelled of wet wood and damp earth. A faint, briny hint drifted up from the lake. My breath fogged in front of me, slow and uneven. I walked toward the dock. The boards were slick, cold beneath my boots. The moonlight pooled in pale patches, shifting with the ripples. And then it began, a deep, slow creak, rising and falling. Heavy steps along the planks. I froze. The mist swirled around my ankles. The hum of the night pressed close, like the lake itself was listening. I looked around. The shore was empty. The reeds whispered, brushing together. No one should be there. The dock groaned again. This time, closer to where I stood. I held my breath, though it shivered under invisible weight. I stepped forward slowly. The damp would press cold against my palms as I ran them along the railing. A faint metallic scent lingered in the air, sharp and sudden. The steps had stopped. Silence settled like dust. Then I noticed them. Footprints. Damp, heavy, leading away from the dock. No one around to make them. No other mark on the water or earth. I knelt. The smell of mud rose, rich and wet. The footprints ended in the mist. Vanished. The dock creaked again. This time under nothing. Or maybe under something I couldn't see. I stared into the water. Reflections of moonlight rippled and fractured. A shadow lingered beneath the dock's edge. Too dark, too still, too wrong. I took a step back. The boards hummed faintly underfoot. The air felt heavier, almost alive. The mist curled around my boots, clinging and cold. I wanted to leave. My heart whispered warnings I couldn't put into words. Soft footsteps echoed behind me, or maybe within me. The footprints on the dock didn't move. But the groaning continued, a slow, deliberate pulse through the wood. I tried to convince myself it was the wind, the settling of old timber. But even as I thought it, the dock moaned again. Not a wind's whim, not random. I knelt once more, traced the damp impressions with my fingers, cold and sticky, disappearing under my touch. No one had walked there, but someone or something had been. The night held its breath. The water shivered. A faint hum rose from the lake, subtle and endless. I stood. The footprints led into the fog. The dock whispered beneath my feet. And I knew, even if I left, I would hear it again. The mist curled around the pilings. The moonlight fractured on the water. The dock waited, groaning, patient, silent. The lake lay quiet under an early winter night. Mist had rolled in thick, hugging the water and creeping into the trees. The cold smelled sharp, wet pine and mud, and something older beneath it. I walked along the shoreline, boots sinking slightly into frost-tipped grass. The fog swirled around my legs, cool and damp. Each step left a faint imprint, disappearing almost instantly. At first, I thought it was only mist, only the fog thickening, dancing with the moonlight. But then I noticed movement, shadows, too dark to be trees, shifting along the edge of the water, pacing slowly, deliberately. I froze. The air pressed close. Every breath tasted of damp water and iron. I blinked, and there were more than one. Figures, stretching and bending with the fog, moving as though circling me or the shoreline itself. A soft hum rose from the water, not loud, not steady, but enough to crawl under the skin. My hands tingled from cold and something else, fear curling in the marrow. I stepped closer to the water's edge. The fog clung to my sleeves, dripping cold. The figures shifted again, closer than before, or closer than they should have been. I want to call out, but my voice dissolved in the fog. The only reply was a soft, rustling whisper through the reeds. I could see their outlines now, tall, thin, impossibly still when the fog settled. When they moved, it was slow, deliberate, like shadows bending without bodies. I swallowed. The hum rose, or perhaps I imagined it. It tickled my ears, and the water licked the shore beneath my boots. I turned my head, trying to see through the mist. The figures always seemed just beyond clarity. A hand? A face? Nothing solid. Just shifting dark shapes that didn't belong. A chill ran up my spine. The fog pressed against my face. It smelled of wet earth, decay, and something sharp I couldn't place. The figures, they weren't walking. They were pacing. Patiently. Waiting. I stepped back. The frost crunched beneath me. My own shadow stretched across the water, small and weak against theirs. They mirrored the shoreline's curve, bending with it, folding into it. A ripple passed across the lake. The figures trembled with it. Or did the fog move them? My hands shook. My breath came in quick, shallow clouds. I blinked again. The number of figures had grown. I hadn't noticed them arriving. No footsteps on frost, no disturbance in reeds. Only their presence. I wanted to run, but the ground beneath was cold, damp, reluctant. The fog filled my chest. The hum filled my ears. And the shadows, they never paused. I took one careful step backward. The fog swirled around my boots, wrapping me in silence and chill. The figures stayed at the water's edge, watching, waiting. I could feel their gaze without seeing eyes. A pull, soft but insistent, into the gray. Each breath felt heavier, each heartbeat louder in my chest. And then, slowly, they began to fade. Not vanish, exactly, but the fog swallowed them, reshaping, folding them into the night. The lake was quiet again. The frost sparkled faintly in the moonlight. My hands tingled from the cold. The air still hummed softly, a reminder that they had been there. I stayed at the edge of the shore a long time, watching the fog, watching the water, knowing they were out there. And though I walked back to the cabin, their pacing remained with me, soft, persistent, echoing in the quiet of the night. The porch stretched along the water's edge. Evening had settled into pale blues and grays, and the waves whispered against the shore. Salt and damp would fill the air, heavy and familiar. An old rocking chair swayed gently, creaking in rhythm with the waves, back and forth, back and forth. No wind stirred it. No hand guided it. I stepped closer. The board beneath my feet were cold and uneven. The smell of wet pine mingled with something faintly metallic. The chair moved in perfect cadence. Slow, steady, almost deliberate, and behind it a dark shape lingered. I froze. The air pressed into my chest. The hum of the lake filled my ears, low and insistent. At first, I thought it was my shadow, but it didn't move when I did. It stayed, patient, almost breathing. I leaned closer, the boards creaking under careful weight. The waves lapped at the shoreline. The scent of salt and moss wrapped around my ankles. The shape didn't shift, didn't blink, just waited. I could see the outline clearly now. Tall, thin, something beyond me. Cold seemed to pool around it, flowing into the porch boards, curling into the rocking chair. I wanted to touch the chair, to feel the motion stop, but my hand trembled and the air felt thick, almost sticky. The chair rocked faster, just slightly, keeping pace with the waves. A soft, uneven creak filled the quiet. The dark shape didn't flinch. I stepped back. The wooden floorboards whispered beneath my boots. The smell of damp pine grew stronger, mixed with a faint tang of rust. I tried to look away, tried to convince myself it was only the evening, only shadows. But the shape, it had a weight, a presence that pressed into the space behind the chair. A wave rolled closer, brushing foam onto the shore. The rocking slowed, then stopped. The dark shape remained, silent, waiting. I breathed slowly, tasting the cold air. The porch boards beneath me felt hollow. The chair swayed once more imperceptibly, and the shadow seemed to stretch just slightly, as if testing the edges of the porch. I didn't move. I didn't speak. The hum of the lake and the rocking chair filled the silence. Eventually, I stepped back toward the cabin. The chair continued its slow rhythm. The shape lingered, patient, unyielding, and still just out of reach. I stayed on the edge of the porch a long time, listening to the waves, watching the rocking chair, feeling the weight of that dark presence just beyond it. Even now, when I close my eyes, I can see it there, waiting still in the pale light of the empty porch. The lake lay quiet beneath a thin layer of fog. Moonlight scattered over the water in pale, trembling patches. The air smelled of wet pine, damp earth, and something faintly metallic, sharp on the tongue. I was on the cabin porch, watching the shoreline fade into gray. The boards creaked under my weight. Though I hadn't moved much, the hum of the lake pressed softly against my ears. Constant, patient. A rowboat appeared, drifting slowly, almost without effort. The oars moved on their own, dipping in the water in perfect rhythm. I held my breath. The wood of the dock beneath my hands felt cold, slick with mist. The water lapped gently, curling around the hull. A shadowy figure sat in the stern. Its face was turned away. Tall, thin, almost blending with the night. The boat passed slowly, closer, then farther, sliding across the lake like a phantom. I could hear the faint creak of the oars. Soft, rhythmic, impossible. Each stroke carried a whisper of damp wood and cold metal. I wanted to move, to call out, but my voice was gone. The air tasted of salt and pine, and fear pooled in my chest. The figure did not shift, did not turn, only sat, quiet and impossible, following a path I could not name. I stepped closer to the water. The mist curled around my ankles. Clinging, the boat glided past the dock. Closer now, too close, but still out of reach. A faint ripple passed beneath it, not enough to disturb the reflection, but enough to make the shadow tremble. Or was it only my eyes playing tricks? I noticed a hum, subtle and low, threading through the night, a vibration beneath the skin, beneath the boards of the porch. I swallowed. The taste of metal lingered on my tongue. The boat slowed, then drifted on again. The oars dipped with the same silent precision. The shadow remained, unblinking, unmoving. I held my breath. The lake smelled of cold water and moss. Mist drifted into my hair, my clothes, settling on my skin like a soft, damp shroud. I wanted to step back, to leave the dock and retreat into the cabin. But the figure, it felt alive, watching, patient, haunting. The boat drifted past and began to fade into the fog. The oars dipped once more. Then still, the shadow lingered at the edge of perception, folding into the night. I stayed where I was. The mist curled around me. The hum of the lake filled the silence. And though the boat disappeared, I could still feel it. The memory of the shadow, the rhythm of the silent oars. Waiting, just beyond reach, in the soft gray of the fog. The lake stretched black under the early morning fog. The cabin sat just above the waterline, damp with glistening with condensation. The air was thick, smelling of wet earth and the faint, sharp tang of cold water. I stepped onto the porch. The boards were slick beneath my boots. A softening of the lake pressed against the walls, low and patient. At first, I didn't notice. A faint dark streak along the side of the cabin, blending with shadow. Then another, hand-shaped smudges, black, wet, smeared along the waterline, as if something had been climbing up out of the lake. I froze. The boards under my hands were cold, almost sticky. The hum of the water seemed to shift, rising into my chest. I leaned closer. Each print was distinct. 5 fingers spread and clawing. The wood beneath was damp, yet the marks were darker, almost oily. I stepped back. The air smelled sharper now, iron mixed with rotting vegetation. My breath came in shallow clouds, curling in the mist. I pressed my palm against the railing. The wood shivered under my touch. The prints traced along the side, each one higher than the last, as though something had been climbing or emerging. A soft ripple passed ashore. Water licked the cabin's foundations. The hum in the lake grew, subtle and vibrating, like a pulse. I stared, frozen. The smudges ended at the porch level, then stopped. No footprints beyond, no sign of retreat. Only the dark, wet shapes marking the wood. I want to call out, but my voice dissolved in the fog. The air clung to my lungs, cold and thick. A small wave lapped against the cabin. The boards creaked beneath my weight. I traced one of the prints with my finger. Cold, wet, heavy with something I could not name. The hum of the lake grew lower, then disappeared. The mist swirled against the cabin. The print seemed darker now, sharper against the pale wood. I stepped back. The air smelled damp and metallic. The fog pressed against my hair, my shoulders curling around me. I scanned the waterline again. The smudges had an impossible rhythm, like deliberate pacing. 5 fingers, then another 5, all climbing toward the porch. I swallowed. The hum returned, faint, deep beneath the skin. The air seemed to wait with me, patient, heavy. I stayed on the porch, staring, watching the waterline, listening to the lake, feeling the weight of those prints without understanding what had made them. Eventually, the fog thinned slightly. The smudges remained, black, wet, haunting. And though the lake seemed still again, I knew something had touched the cabin. I stepped inside. The boards creaked softly underfoot. The air smelled of damp wood and lingering iron. And the memory of those hand-shaped marks pressed against my mind, a quiet, persistent unease, waiting for me to notice them again. The cabin was quiet, wrapped in the stillness of a late autumn night. Fog pressed against the windows, thick and damp. The air smelled with smoke, wet leaves, and something faintly sharp like iron. I held the lantern in my hands. Its glow was soft, wavering. The boards beneath my boots were cold, slick with mist. A flicker, the light shivered, and there it was, a tall shadow, standing closer to the door than before. Its shape stretched, thin and impossible. I froze. The lantern trembled slightly in my grip, the air pressing thick and heavy, and my breath curled in small clouds. I blinked. The shadow vanished. The lantern steadied. Only the quiet remained, humming softly in the walls and floors. Another flicker. Closer now. Tall, still, patient. A presence leaning against the edge of the light. Waiting. I wanted to move, but my legs refused. The air tasted of damp wood and a faint metallic tang. The lantern flickered again, its light trembling across the floorboards. The shadow shifted slightly toward me this time. A subtle bend, almost imperceptible. I held my breath. The boards creaked softly beneath me, though no one moved. The hum of the cabin settled into my chest. I blinked. The shadow had disappeared. The lantern glowed steady once more, pale and calm. A soft rustling brushed across the room. I could feel the air pressing close, brushing my hair and shoulders. And when the lantern flickered again, closer, the shadow lingered near the doorway, its shape impossible to fully see. Silent, patient. I stepped back. The boards groaned beneath my boots. The fog outside pressed against the window, curling inward. The light steadied. The shadow was gone. I could almost convince myself it was only my eyes playing tricks. Another flicker, and it was there again, a step closer than before. A pause, a presence. I didn't move. I didn't speak. The air hummed, heavy and expectant. The lantern swayed lightly in my hand. Soft shadows crawling along the walls. Finally, the light steadied. The shadow vanished once more. The room felt empty. Yet the weight remained, silent, patient, impossible. I stayed near the lantern. The fog outside thinned slightly. The boards beneath my feet quieted. And though the shadow had disappeared, its closeness lingered in the air. Every flicker of the light reminded me it was waiting, patient, silent, always just beyond the glow. The lake was still. No breeze stirred the water. The night smelled of damp earth, pine, and the faint tang of cold water. I stepped closer to the shoreline. The boards beneath my boots were slick with condensation. Mist curled around my ankles, cold and soft. And then the water moved. Not a ripple from wind, not a tremor from fish. Violent, jerking waves rolled across the lake, rising and falling as if breathing. I froze. The hum of the night pressed into my chest. My breath curled in soft clouds, mingling with the fog. In the waves, I saw them. A dozen dark silhouettes, swaying. Tall, thin, impossible. Rising slowly, bending with the water, as if the lake itself had become alive. I stepped back. The boards groaned beneath me. The mist pressed against my face, cold and damp. The silhouettes shifted, closer now, but impossibly distant. They swayed as one, a slow rhythm that made my chest tighten. I tried to look away, but my eyes refused. The water's surface shimmered under moonlight, reflecting shapes that weren't mine. A faint metallic scent rose from the lake. Iron, sharp, bitter. The hum grew, low and vibrating beneath my skin. I blinked. The shapes dipped beneath the surface, then rose again, each movement deliberate, every ripple bending the water unnaturally. I wanted to step back, but the shoreline felt narrow and closed. Mist curled tightly around my legs. The waves reached closer, and the silhouettes, they didn't just move. They watched. A small wave licked the dock. The silhouette swayed with it, leaning toward me as if testing the boundary between water and land. I held my breath. The air tasted metallic and wet. The hum vibrated in my chest. Soft, impossible, patient. I stepped backward again. The fog shifted with each motion, wrapping tighter, pressing closer. The lake heaved quietly, the ripples rising without wind, the dark shapes rising with them. I could see their outlines clearly now. Long arms, bending unnaturally, bodies swaying just beneath the surface. Eyes, maybe, or something like them, glinting faintly in the pale moonlight. The hum softened, the water calmed, but the shapes lingered, moving just beneath, just beyond clarity. I turned from the lake. Mist wrapped around my shoulders. The boards groaned faintly under my feet. The silhouettes faded slowly beneath the surface, but the lake still trembled quietly. as if waiting for me to look back. I stepped onto the shore. The fog thinned slightly. The cold lingered in my bones. The ripples receded. But I could still feel the presence of the water, the memory of those swaying shapes, patient, impossible, watching just beneath the surface. The cabin was quiet, the evening thick with damp air. Mist curled around the windows, pressing against the glass. The smell of wet pine and old wood settled in my nose. I sat alone. The floorboards groaned softly beneath my weight. A faint hum lingered in the walls. Steady, low. Then I saw it, a shadow stretching across the ceiling. Slow, wide, impossible. I blinked. The boards beneath my hand were cold. The air felt heavier, as if the room itself were holding its breath. The shadows shifted, twisted, and yet nothing below moved. No foot, no hand, no flicker for me. I leaned back. The hum deepened, vibrating softly against my chest. The smell of damp earth from outside drifted in, mingling with the faint metallic tang in the cabin. It stretched again, bending at angles that shouldn't exist. Fingers, or something like them, brushing across the ceiling's timber, hovering, patient. I swallowed. The boards creaked softly beneath me. I could hear the mist sliding along the window panes, wrapping the cabin in silence. The shadow twisted once more. Slowly, deliberately, it leaned into corners, filling the room with its impossible shape. I wanted to look away. My eyes refused. Every movement of the shadow drew me in, closer, tightening the room's air. A small rustle passed through the cabin. Not loud, not sudden, but enough to make my skin prickle. The shadow continued, independent of any light or movement. I breathed slowly, in through my nose, out my mouth. The air felt damp, thick, and alive. The shadow stretched again. Edges softened, then sharpened, folding into corners. A subtle pressure pressed down from the ceiling, not heavy, but undeniable. I could almost see shapes within it, faces or masks, bending in the darkness. The hum of the cabin threaded through my chest. I sat unmoving, heart steady but aware. It twisted one final time. Long, thin, impossible. Then paused, waiting. The air felt lighter. The mist outside shifted. The boards beneath my fingers warmed slightly from the fire's dim glow. I stayed where I was, watching the ceiling, breathing in the damp night air, listening to the hum, feeling the shadow linger. And though the shape never moved again, its presence remained, patient, silent, stretching just beyond perception. The night pressed heavy over the lake. Mist curled along the shore, wet and cold. The smell of pine and damp wood lingered, sharp against the still air. I walked toward the old boathouse. The boards beneath my boots were slick with frost and moss. A soft, constant creak hummed from the structure, like the building itself was breathing. I pushed the door open. The hinges moaned, rusty and reluctant. Inside, the air was thick, heavy with damp and decay. The walls were scratched, claw-like marks, deep and jagged, stretching across the wood. I ran my hand along them. Rough, cold, angry. The faint smell of iron rose, metallic and sharp. It mixed with the musty rot of old timber. The hum of the lake pressed in from outside, low and insistent. A shadow waited, in the far corner. Tall, thin, impossible to make out clearly. I froze. The floorboards whispered beneath my weight. The air felt thick, clinging to my skin, curling around my lungs. The shadow didn't move, didn't breathe. It simply waited. I stepped forward. The scratches on the walls seemed to ripple beneath my fingertips. The faint metallic tang lingered on my tongue. The hum of the lake rose, then faded. Mist seeped through cracks in the walls, curling toward the corner. The shadow remained patient. I wanted to look away, but my eyes stayed fixed. Its presence was weighty, impossible to ignore. The air shifted. A soft, uneven creak passed through the boathouse, not from the boards beneath me, but from the shadow itself. I swallowed. My breath fogged the air. The smell of damp timber mixed with faint rust. I stepped back toward the door. The scratches glinted faintly in the pale moonlight. The shadow shifted ever so slightly, leaning into the darkness. The hum lingered in my chest, soft, low, vibrating beneath the skin. I could feel it in my fingers, my spine, the soles of my boots. I left the boathouse slowly. The boards whispered underfoot. The door creaked shut behind me. The shadow didn't follow. Or maybe it did, waiting just beyond the wood and mist. The scratches remained. And though I walked back to cabin, the boathouse waited, silent, patient, its presence pressing through the night. The lake lay still under the pale light of a late autumn evening. Mist hovered above the water, curling in soft, cold tendrils. The air smelled of wet earth and pine, sharp and damp against my skin. I knelt at the edge, peering into the dark water. The boards beneath my knees were slick, cold, and slightly mossy. The hum of the lake pressed softly against my ears. My reflection stared back, calm, familiar, pale in the dim light. Then I noticed it, another figure behind me, dark, silent, reaching closer, impossibly still. I froze, the mist pressed into my face. The taste of iron lingered on my tongue. The figure's shape stretched across the reflection, tall, thin, leaning forward as if testing the boundary between water and air. I could feel the weight of it pressing down, though nothing touched me. I blinked. The ripples shifted under my hands. The reflection wavered, and the figure remained patient, silent, just beyond my own image. I swallowed. The boards groaned beneath my weight. The smell of wet wood and something metallic wrapped around me. I wanted to look away. My eyes refused. Every movement of the water pulled my gaze back to the figure. The mist curled higher, brushing against my shoulders. A small wave lapped against the shore, chilling my fingers. The figure leaned closer in the reflection, impossibly reaching to the surface. I could feel the air grow heavier, cold pressed into my lungs. The hum of the lake threaded through my chest, slow and low. The reflection shivered. My own image wavered. The dark figure moved nearer, closer to the edge of perception. I stepped back slightly. The board beneath me whispered underfoot. The mist wrapped tighter, damp and cool against my skin. The figure lingered. Its shadow stretched across my reflection, silent, patient, reaching, always just beyond the water's surface. I stayed there, unmoving, breath shallow, the hum of the lake filling the space around me. Eventually, the mist thinned. The water settled. My reflection returned to calm, yet the dark figure remained, etched just behind me, waiting in the quiet, its presence lingering, silent and impossible, beneath the pale, trembling light. Morning fog hung low over the lake. The air smelled of damp wood and cold water, sharp against my lungs. I walked down the dock, boots quiet against the slick boards, and then I saw it, a wooden chair, at the very end of the dock. No one had placed it there. No footprints led to it. The boards beneath were still damp from last night's mist. I stepped closer. The wood was weathered, rough under my fingertips. The faint smell of pine lingered, mingling with the lake's metallic tang. I circled the chair, alone, silent. It sat perfectly still, waiting. The hum of the lake pressed in softly. Waves lapped quietly against the dock. Mist curled around my ankles. At dusk, I returned. The fog had thinned, but the air was heavy and warm. The chair was no longer empty. A figure sat in it, tall, shadowed, impossible to fully see. It didn't move, didn't breathe, or at least I couldn't tell. I froze. The boards beneath my boots groaned softly. The smell of wet wood wrapped around me, pressing against my skin. The figure remained, silent, patient. The lake shimmered under the last pale light of day. I blinked. The air was still. The mist curled faintly around the dock, thin now but insistent. I wanted to speak. My voice didn't come. Only my breath mingled with the soft hum of the water. I stepped closer, careful. The figure didn't shift. Its presence was weighty, pressing into the space around it. The chair creaked softly. Or maybe it was the wind, though the air was still. The shadow leaned subtly, almost imperceptibly, toward the edge of the dock. I held my breath. The lake reflected the fading sky. Mist lingered in my hair, cold and damp. The figure stayed until the light fully left the horizon. Then it seemed to fade, not moving, not leaving, but folding into the shadows. The chair remained, silent, empty, waiting. I stepped back, The boards whispered beneath my boots. The lake rippled gently, though no wind stirred. And the memory of that figure lingered, patient, as if waiting for the next evening or the next dawn to return to the chair at the dock. Night pressed over the lake. Heavy and still, mist hovered above the water, curling in slow, cold tendrils. The air smelled of frozen wood, wet earth, and the faint tang of ice. I stepped closer to the shore. The boards beneath my boots were slick with frost. My breath curled in soft clouds, mingling with the cold, damp fog. The lake was frozen, not solid, not still in the usual way. Every ripple, every tiny wave, paused mid-motion. Time seemed to have halted. The hum of the night pressed against my chest. The frozen surface reflected the pale moonlight, silver and sharp. A faint metallic tang lingered in the air, and then I saw it, a dark figure walking across the surface. Slow, deliberate, no splash, no ripple disturbed the ice-frozen waves beneath it. I froze. The boards beneath me whispered. The mist pressed closer, damp against my skin. It moved steadily, impossible and patient. The figure's shape stretched in the pale light. I couldn't make out its face, only the sense of it, of presence, of weightless motion over frozen water. I blinked. The lake remained still around it. Not a single ripple shifted. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. I stepped closer, careful. The frost crunched faintly under my boots. The hum of the frozen night vibrated softly through the soles of my feet. The figure paused. It tilted slightly, a slow gesture. I couldn't tell if it noticed me or if it simply existed. Silent, patient, impossible. The mist curled around the edges of the lake. The smell of ice and wet earth wrapped the night tightly. The pale light made the frozen ripples glimmer, like glass suspended in midair. I tried to look away. My eyes refused. The figure continued, step by step, across the frozen surface, leaving no trace, making no sound. I held my breath. The chill pressed into my lungs. The air hummed low, steady, vibrating softly in my chest. The figure reached the middle of the lake, paused, and turned. Not toward me, not away. Just turned, a slow, deliberate pivot, stretching impossibly across the frozen waves. I swallowed. The boards beneath my boots creaked softly. The mist shifted around me, and though the figure remained distant, its presence pressed through the still air, through the frozen water, through the quiet night itself. I stepped back from the shore. The frost crunched underfoot. The frozen lake held its impossible shape, ripples suspended in mid-motion, and the dark figure walking endlessly, silently, over the surface of paused time. The forest was quiet, the air thick with mist and the smell of wet pine. Twigs snapped softly under my boots, each one sharp in the stillness. The fading sun painted the treetops with pale, cold light. I noticed at first at the edge of the trees, a figure, tall, shadowed, standing motionless. Eyes, or something like them, fixed on me, unblinking. I paused. The hum of the forest pressed into my chest. A chill ran along my spine, brushing my hair. I walked. The figure stayed. Every step I took, every turn, its head tilted, following me, slow, patient, silent. Mist curled around my ankles, cold and damp. The air carried the sharp scent of pine and earth. The forest floor was slick. Each fallen leaf was against my boots. I stopped again. The figure remained. Shadows stretched unnaturally around it, blending into the tree line. I could feel its gaze pressing against my skin. I tried looking away. Impossible. Every movement I made, every breath I drew, it mirrored with that silent tilt of the head. The wind shifted slightly. Rustling needles whispered faintly above. The figure didn't move, yet the presence felt heavier. Watching, waiting, patient. I took a few more steps. The boards and old footpath groaned faintly underfoot. Mist rose higher, brushing my face and hair. The figure's silhouette remained sharp against the fading light. The forest seemed to lean in. The air thickened with cold and damp. Even the rustling leaves sounded muted, measured. I stopped once more. The figure didn't flinch. Its head tilted again, impossibly synchronized with mine, as if the trees themselves bent to reveal it more clearly. I could feel the space between us shrink, though I hadn't moved closer. The mist wrapped around me tightly, cold and persistent. Finally, I turned back toward the path I had come. The figure followed, still tilting its head, watching, patient, silent. The sun dipped below the horizon. Shadows stretched long, blending the figure into the dark pines. I could hear the distant hum of the forest and feel its gaze linger, even as I walked toward the safety of the open clearing. I didn't look back again, but I could still feel it, waiting in the trees, patient, silent, tilting its head, watching, always watching. The lake was calm, the night thick with fog. Cold air pressed against my skin, carrying the scent of wet earth and pine. Mist curled around the dock, slow and damp, brushing my boots. Then it happened. A splash, sharp and loud, echoing across the water. I froze, but the surface remained still, glass smooth, no ripple, no wave. The hum of the night pressed softly against my chest. The smell of damp would wrap around me. A faint metallic tang lingered, sharp against the fog. I stepped closer to the shore. Mist clung to my hair, my sleeves. Every board beneath my feet groaned softly. And then I saw it, a figure, dark and still, standing at the water's edge, watching. I blinked. The splash repeated in my mind, but the water remained perfectly smooth. The figure's presence was heavy, pressing into the cold night air. I swallowed. The mist curled around my fingers, cold and damp. The faint hum of the lake seemed louder, vibrating through the boards. I took a careful step forward. The figure didn't move. Its shadow stretched long across the fog and the pale moonlight. The air felt thick, heavier than before. Breath came slowly. Each exhale fogged the chill around my face. I wanted to speak. Nothing came, only the distant hum of the lake and the whisper of mist. I edged closer. The boards beneath me creaked softly. The figure remained patient, silent, impossible to see clearly. The splash echoed again in my mind, though the water remained still. The night pressed tighter, holding its breath with me. The figure's presence lingered, weighty and patient. I stepped back toward the dock. The boards whispered under my boots. The fog swirled around the shore, soft and persistent. The figure stayed, watching, waiting. Its dark shape pressed against the fog, silent and impossible, as if it had risen from the lake itself, and remained patient in the cold, still night. The cabin was quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against your chest. Outside, the wind had stopped. Inside, even the old clock had fallen silent. I stepped in. The wood beneath my boots smelled of cold pine and dust. Air hung thick, almost heavy, against my skin. Breath, even that seemed absent. Every inhale felt muted, swallowed by the stillness. A shadow moved, slowly, gracefully, across the floor, across the walls. No sound, no disturbance, just presence. I blinked. The faint scent of smoke lingered, old and dry, though the stove was cold. Dust motes hovered in the pale light, frozen like time itself. I tried to speak. Nothing came. Even my own voice had been swallowed. The shadows shifted, not hurried, not chaotic. It moved with intention, almost as if it were aware of the silence around it. I reached for the table. Fingers brushed the rough wood. Still no sound. Even the small objects, cups, papers, remained perfectly still, untouched. The air pressed closer, cold and dry, yet thick with an unseen weight. I could feel it against my skin, brushing my hair. The shadow paused, a faint tilt, as if observing me. I dared not move. Time stretched, long and unreal. My boots whispered softly against the floor. Or maybe that was my imagination, pressed into the silence. The shadow continued its slow glide, indifferent, unstoppable. I leaned against the wall. The smell of old wood and damp pine filled the muted air. The shadow passed near, its presence brushing the edge of perception. I realized the cabin wasn't just quiet. It was waiting. Every object, every corner, every surface seemed to hold its breath. I tried to leave. The door creaked softly. Even that barely disturbed the silence. The shadow lingered, patient, unhurried, still watching. I stepped outside. The air felt heavier now, still cold, still thick with absence. The wind had not returned. Even the birds were gone. The cabin remained, silent, empty, yet full of something unseen, a presence that moved freely in the stillness, patient, watching, and waiting. The cabin was quiet. Even the clock seemed to hold its breath. A thin mist drifted past a window, curling like smoke over the darkened lake. I found it lying there, a journal, worn, the edges frayed with age. Its cover smelled faintly of old wood and damp paper. I opened it slowly. The pages whispered against my fingers. The last entry was jagged, hurried, almost trembling. They come when the lake is still. The words pressed against me, heavy, cold. I felt the air thicken, damp and dense around my chest. Outside, the lake waited, dark and patient. I went to the window. The surface of the water reflected the pale moonlight, glassy, perfectly still. No ripple, no wave. Nothing moved. A faint hum seemed to rise from the night. The smell of wet pine and cold stone filled my nose. The mist pressed closer, brushing against my sleeves. I leaned closer to the journal. The pages smelled of ink and shadow. The words seemed to pulse faintly, echoing in the silence. I stepped back. The lake remained still, too still, as if holding itself in careful, unnatural suspension. I swallowed. The floor beneath my boots whispered faintly. My breath came slow, careful, cold against the night air. Something shifted behind me. I turned. Nothing. Only the journal. Still open. Still warning. I watched the lake. The moon stretched across the water. The glassy surface shimmered faintly, pale and impossibly smooth. I felt it then. A weight pressing through the quiet. A presence hovering just beyond the edge of sight. The hum of the still night grew louder in my chest. Mist curled around the cabin walls. The journal seemed heavier in my hands. I dared not close it. Its warning etched into my mind. The lake was too still, too silent. I backed away from the window. The hum of the night pressed tighter, and I realized a presence had shifted closer, though nothing moved in the glassy reflection. The air trembled faintly. The cold pressed against my face. Even the rustling of the trees outside seemed muted, cautious. I stayed by the bed, clutching the journal. The moonlight glimmered on the frozen lake, and I understood. They come when the lake is still. I could feel it, the patient weight of watching. Something waiting, just beyond the glassy water, silent, cold, and utterly inevitable. The forest pressed close around the cabin. Mist curled between the trees, damp and slow, brushing my sleeves. The dirt path stretched ahead, thin and uneven, lined with shadows. Each night it seemed longer, winding deeper, curling further into the dark. The smell of wet earth and pine hung heavy in the air. I walked carefully. Boots sank slightly into the soft soil. Leaves crunched faintly, whispering underfoot. Shadows waited along the edges. Still, patient, almost breathing with the fog. I felt them tilt, stretch, leaning closer with the mist. The path seemed alive, pulling the cabin deeper into the forest. Every step felt like it dragged me further, slowly, steadily, towards something I could not see. I paused. The silence pressed in, cold and heavy. Even the wind had stopped, leaving only the faint hum of the night. The shadows shifted. Not quickly, not suddenly. Just bending, patient, stretching along the path like dark water. I swallowed. The scent of damp leaves and decay filled my nose. The soil beneath my fingers was soft, almost warm, though the air was cold. Each step forward felt uncertain. The path had grown again, longer than I remembered. The forest seemed to lean closer, its branches brushing against the fog and my skin. I stopped. A faint rustle, almost static, echoed in the stillness. Shadows clung to the edges, patient and waiting. I turned back toward the cabin. It felt farther than before, small and fragile in the distance, surrounded by fog and stretching darkness. The path seemed to pull at me, gentle, insistent, unrelenting. Every breath came slow, heavy, and wet with a forest scent. I stepped forward again. Leaves crunched softly. Mist pressed against my face, wet and cool. The shadows followed, moving only when I blinked. I realized then that the cabin was not fixed. It shifted, pulled, drawn deeper into the forest each night. The path stretched endlessly, lined with patient, waiting shapes. I stopped once more. The forest hummed faintly, almost imperceptibly, while the dirt path wound away. dark and eternal. I stayed there, breath shallow, hands cold, watching the shadows lean into the fog. The path waited, stretching on, pulling me, pulling everything deeper into its silence. The cabin settled into the night. Wind whispered through the trees, thin and trembling. The moon cast pale streaks across the floorboards. It was midnight. I noticed the windows first. Fog creeping along the glass, slow, deliberate, curling at the edges. I leaned closer. Cold pressed against my face. The damp smell of mist mingled with the scent of old wood. Handprints began to appear. Dozens of them. Smears pressed on the outside, dark and wet against the fog glass. I froze. The hum of the night felt heavier. Shadows pulled behind the edges of the window. Waiting. Figures pressed closer. Tall, dark, and impossible to distinguish. Their shapes blurred with the fog, leaning just beyond the glass. I felt the air thicken. Each breath came slow and tight. Even the soft rustle of my clothing seemed amplified in the stillness. I traced a hand along the window. Cold, damp, empty. The handprints remained, pressing insistently from the other side. The fog thickened. Shadows moved subtly, almost imperceptibly, their heads tilted, as though studying, waiting, patient and silent. I stepped back. The floor whispered under my boots. The cabin itself seemed to hold its breath. Outside, the figures leaned closer. The glass fog again. Smudges spread, twisting like long fingers across the surface. I could feel them there, not moving, not speaking, yet aware of me in a way that pressed against my chest. A quiet dread, smothering, slow. The wind stilled. Even the trees held silent. I listened to my own heartbeat, hollow and quick against the quiet. I wanted to look away, but the handprints shifted as if reaching for me. The shapes leaned, almost alive, almost breathing. I stayed near the center of the room. The fog on the windows swirled, reflecting moonlight in faint, wet streaks. The figures remained just beyond, patient, unyielding. Time seemed to stretch. Each second dragged with the weight of shadow and glass. The cabin felt smaller, the air thicker, as if the night itself had leaned in. I watched the window. The handprints pressed closer. Dark shapes pressed beyond. And I understood the stillness was not empty. It was full of waiting, patient, smothering presence. The night held me in place, breathless, frozen, aware of them just beyond the glass. The cabin sat quiet. Fog curled low over the lake, thick and cold. Branches scraped the walls with slow, patient fingers. Night had settled deep. The moon was pale, dim, spilling faint light across the dock. The air smelled damp, earthy, carrying a weight that pressed against my chest. Then it came. A knock. Slow, deliberate. It rolled through the cabin like a pulse. Hollow, deep, echoing off the walls, off the floor, into my bones. I held my breath. The silence returned, thick and uneasy. The hum of the wind felt distant, almost unwilling to move. I stepped to the door, cold under my fingertips. The wood rough, faintly damp from the night. I opened it. Nothing waited, only fog curling like smoke around the dock. And then I saw it, a shadow, far down, where the dock met the black water. It stood unmoving, tall, dark, a shape that seemed too deliberate to belong to the night. The moonlight caught only edges, leaving the rest swallowed by shadow. I stepped outside. The boards creaked beneath my weight. Each breath felt too loud. The shadow didn't move, didn't shift, didn't blink. The air smelled wet, faintly metallic. Cold brushed my skin in little flickers, like a warning. The fog curled, hiding the edges of the dock, hiding what else might be there. I called a name, softly. No answer, only the quiet ripple of the lake, lapping against the posts. I took another step. The shadow seemed closer. Or maybe I was moving too slowly. Or maybe it had never been far at all. A static hum filled the silence. Not loud, not sharp, just under the skin of the night. It hummed with the weight of waiting. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. Eyes fixed, the shadow waited. The knock had stopped, but the feeling remained. Heavy, slow, insistent. I returned to the cabin. Door closed softly behind me, with muffling the dark. I could still feel it out there, watching. The dock stretched empty, yet the shadow lingered. Long, patient, deliberate. I sat near the window. Fog pressed against the glass. A chill ran through my chest. Quiet, endless. The night carried on. Cold air, the scent of wet wood, the hum of unseen things. The shadow waited still, far down the dock, and I knew it would be there when the knock came again. The lake lay still. Fog hugged the shoreline, soft and wet. The air smelled faintly of cold water and pine. Far across the water, faint lanterns glowed, little flickers, warm and golden, floating above the dark line of trees. They moved slowly, like lanterns caught in a breathless wind. I leaned closer to the window. The board beneath my hands were cold, rough. The silence pressed around me, thick and almost solid. The lights wavered, drifting closer to the water, not with the wind, but with something else. Shapes moved beneath them, dark forms, taller than a man, gliding in the water as if it were solid. Each shadow carried a lantern, lifting like a gift or a warning. The reflection rippled, though the lake was calm. Water kissed the shore in tiny laps, trembling under invisible weight. A faint hum ran through the air, low, vibrating in my chest. I stepped outside. Mist curled around my ankles. The night smelled damp, metallic, like the promise of something long buried. The lanterns drifted closer. The shadows beneath them moved in perfect, silent rhythm. No splash, no sound. Only the slow glide of darkness across glassy water. I want to call out. The words froze in my throat. Even my breath seemed too loud, too sharp against the quiet. One lantern tilted closer to the shore. Its light touched the water, scattering into small sparks across the surface. The shadow beneath it paused, then lifted the lantern higher. Another followed, and another. The line of light stretched across the lake, carried by figures that should not exist. I felt the cold press into my bones. The mist stung my skin. Every rustle of the trees sounded louder, like whispers behind my ears. The lanterns paused, hung just above the water, swaying slightly. The shadows beneath them bent, almost bowing. I stepped back. The fog swallowed the shore behind me. Silence wrapped around the cabin, tighter than ever. When I glanced again, the lanterns were moving, drifting slowly, deliberately away from the trees, pulled deeper into the lake by forms that seemed alive and patient. The water held their weight without a sound. Each ripple froze before it could reach the shore. Time itself felt hesitant, bending around the dark figures and their lights. I stayed at the window. Fingers pressed cold against the glass. The lake stretched endless, the fog thick and trembling with every pulse of shadow beneath the lanterns. And then they vanished. The lantern sank slowly, leaving only faint golden echoes on the water. The shadows dissolved into the night, melting into the mist and the dark. Only the lake remained, still, silent, waiting. And I, trembling, realized the lights had not been lanterns, nor the forms beneath them human, just shadows and patience. Morning light spilled weakly through the fog. The lake lay still, silver and cold. The wind whispered across the shore, soft and restless. I stepped onto the floorboards. Wet, damp, a trail of footprints stretched toward the lake. I hadn't left them. The cabin felt different, closer somehow. The boards groaned under my weight, bending subtly with each step. I traced the footprints with a finger. They were heavy, deliberate, and they led from the water's edge, across the porch, into the cabin itself. Outside, the shoreline had changed. Sand and mud pressed closer to floorboards. The reeds bent strangely, brushing against the walls like hands. I pressed my palm to the door. Cold seeped through the wood, damp and alive. Every morning, it seemed, the lake crept further inside. The air smelled of wet earth and old wood, faint, metallic, like something dragging beneath the water. The mist hovered close, curling around the cabin in silent fingers. I turned, listening. Silence. No birds, no wind, just a faint hum of the lake breathing. And the footprints, they never faded, always fresh, always leading inward. I walked to the window. The water gleamed unnaturally, glassy and black beneath the rising sun. Shoreline and cabin had shifted again. The wall closest to the lake seemed unnervingly close. I could see my reflection in the water, and behind it, something darker, almost touching the glass. Not quite a shadow, not quite still. I stepped back. The floorboards moaned. The scent of damp was thickened, stifling. It was as if the lake itself pressed through the walls. I pressed my ear to the floor. Water whispered beneath. Wet, patient, endless. Breathing in rhythm with something unseen. I tried to leave the cabin. The door was slightly off. Closer. The frame seemed smaller. The latch tighter. Every morning, it felt less like leaving and more like being trapped. I touched the wall beside the door. Cold, solid, but wet, damp streaks marred the wood. Fingers? I didn't want to look, but I did. The footprints continued across the room, toward the far wall, toward the lake that seemed to have edged its way into the very foundation. I breathed slowly, trying to steady myself. The fog pressed against the windows. I imagined the cabin floating closer, sliding inch by inch into the water, and the footprints following. A single ripple broke the lake's surface. Not from wind, not from anything I could see, just a movement, deliberate, patient, matching the rhythm of the prints. I sat on the floor, knees to chest. The air tasted of cold water and wet wood. I could hear the faint shift of the cabin settling. Closer, always closer. Outside, the shoreline disappeared into mist. The lake and the cabin blurred together. Footprints on the floor glistened faintly, reflecting pale light. Leading, always leading. I wanted to scream, but the silence swallowed me. The damp pressed in. The lake and the cabin, one and the same, patient and endless. And I realized it was not the cabin moving. It was the water. The lake was reclaiming its own, slowly, inexorably, and the footprints were waiting for me to follow. Night pressed against the windows. The fog hung low, curling around the cabin in pale, restless fingers. The lake outside was still, impossibly quiet. I woke to the soft hum of nothing. No creak of the boards. No rustle of wind. No breath. At first, I thought it was sleep playing tricks. Shadows had always moved outside, at the edge of the trees, across the water. But tonight, they were gone. I stepped into the hallway. Cold wood under my feet. The air tasted of damp and dust. And there it was, tall, still, waiting. Not a shadow against the wall. Not something outside the glass. Inside. I froze, heart ticking painfully in my ears. The smell of wet earth lingered, though the door was closed. A faint hum vibrated in the floorboards. The figure didn't move. Not a breath, not a shift. Just stood, watching. I tried to look away, but my eyes stayed fixed. Its outline blurred slightly, yet unmistakable. Closer than I had ever allowed myself to imagine. The hallways stretched endlessly. Each step I took seemed swallowed by silence. The cabin itself felt smaller, tighter, as though the walls leaned in to watch. I reached for the light switch, fingers trembling. No response. Darkness didn't falter. The pale glow of moonlight made the figure taller, more immense. I whispered, almost to myself. Nothing answered. Even my breath sounded strange, foreign, loud against the quiet. Time slowed. The hum in the floorboards grew low and insistent. The air grew heavier, pressing against my chest. The shadow remained. Still, patient, I wanted to retreat. To the bedroom. To the window. Anywhere. But the cabin seemed to shift around me. Hallway longer. Floorboards warped beneath my weight. I felt the faintest brush of movement. Not wind. Not air. Something in the dark, just beyond touch. The figure did not advance, yet I felt pursued. I tried to blink it away. The outline lingered, towering. Edges softened, yet weight pressed down. Every instinct screamed to run. Every muscle frozen. The smell grew stronger. Metallic, wet like the lake in the fog. I realized it had been here all along, just waiting for the moment silence swallowed me. I held my breath. The cabin breathed too. Slow, deliberate, echoing the rhythm of that silent watcher. The board beneath me groaned, faint but deliberate. I stepped back. The figure's height, seemed to bend the ceiling. Closer with each heartbeat, not moving yet closing in. The air shimmered. Not heat, not light. Something wrong, almost alive. I whispered again. No reply. No shift. Only the soft, overwhelming presence. I sank to the floor. Cold would press into my spine. The cabin's corners vanished into shadow. The figure remained vast, patient, crushing in its stillness. And I understood. The shadows were never outside. They never left. They had only waited for quiet, for the moment I was alone. And in that quiet, the cabin, the lake, the night, it was all theirs. I stayed perfectly still, breath shallow, heart tight, waiting. The figure did not move. It never needed to. It only waited. The air was thick with fog. The lake mirrored the night like black glass. Every sound, every breath, felt amplified and small at once. I stayed close to the cabin, feet pressed into cold, damp earth. The wind had stopped. Even the trees were still. Figures began to appear. At first, just shadows at the tree-line. Then more, dozens of them, silent, tall, stretching toward the water. I could see their reflections in the black surface. Sharp, perfect. Still, they moved closer, yet never made a sound. The lantern on the porch flickered, weak and trembling. I held it in my hands, feeling its warmth fade as the light dimmed. A static hum seemed to rise from the water. The air grew heavy, smelling faintly of wet wood and iron. The figures surrounded the cabin now. I counted their forms reflected in the glassy lake. Dozens, each shadow taller than the last. Silent, watching, waiting. The lantern died. Darkness swallowed the porch, the cabin, the edge of the lake. Even the reflections vanished. I felt the chill of air press against my skin, cold and unyielding. The silence was complete. No wind, no rustling of trees, no heartbeat but my own, loud in my chest. I moved forward, feet crunching on gravel, though I hardly felt the sound. The shadows did not shift. They had been here, waiting all along. I could sense them now. Breathing, watching, the weight of dozens of shapes pressed inward, as though the night itself had gathered around me. My body grew heavy. Time slowed. I glanced at the water. Not a ripple, not a flicker, just black, endless, and deep. I whispered, almost by accident. No answer, no movement, only the soft, suffocating press of their presence. I realized I could not leave. The path I had walked so many nights seemed to dissolve. The cabin, the lake, even the fog felt permanent, eternal. The figures leaned closer. Not physically, yet the space tightened. Shadows pulled at the edge of perception. And I understood. This was not a visit, not a warning. It was a gathering, and I had been part of it all along. The cold seeped through my clothes. The dampness of the earth pressed into my fingers and toes. I could feel each shape in the dark, silent and patient. I sank to the ground, back against the cabin wall. The figures were everywhere now, not just outside, but in the air, the fog, the black water. I could hear nothing but my own shallow breathing. Each inhale seemed loud, intrusive. The night had swallowed everything else. I closed my eyes. The world shrank to the cold press of earth and the weight of waiting. Time itself felt still. The lake, the fog, the cabin, frozen with me inside. And then, not a sound, not a flicker, just final, perfect silence. I understood. There was nowhere to go. Nothing would come. Everything had ended in this quiet, this dark, this lake. I let the shadows fold around me. Let the cold seep through. Let the silence take everything. No movement, no light, no breath, but mine. I was alone yet surrounded. The night held me. The lake held them. And the cabin, finally, held nothing else.